Baek Sung-hyun had built an empire on the singular ability to read the hidden agendas of others. 20 years navigating the razor edge of the Seoul underworld had taught him to spot a lie before it was whispered and desperation before it showed in the eyes. The women who frequented his high-end clubs wore their intentions like a cloying perfume, heavy, obvious, and suffocating. They smiled with practiced calculation and laughed with an agenda he could map out in his sleep. So, when Aaliyah walked into his private office at Eclipse, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm, and her 6-year-old son's hand gripped tightly in the other, he noticed immediately that she didn't smile at all. "Mr. Beck," her voice was professional, yet laced with a guarded caution. "I am the illustrator your manager hired. If this is a bad time, I can return later." 3 days before she walked into the cold, marble-clad lion's den of Eclipse, Aaliyah sat in her kitchen, the air smelling of toasted oats and the faint, persistent scent of lemon-scented floor cleaner that never quite masked the dampness of the apartment. She was hunched over her laptop, the screen's blue light casting a ghostly glow over her bronze skin. Beside her, Micah was perched on a stool, his small legs swinging in a rhythmic arc that kicked the underside of the counter with a soft thud-thud-thud. He was humming a theme from a Space Explorer cartoon, oblivious to the red numbers blinking on his mother's banking app. Aaliyah's eyes burned. The balance was a joke, 2 digits that wouldn't cover the electric bill, let alone the rent due in 14 days. She looked at Micah, noticing the way his toes poked through the front of his sneakers. He needed new shoes, a winter coat that didn't stop at his wrists, and the vitamins the doctor had recommended for his persistent cough. The phone on the counter vibrated, the screen lighting up with a call from Corinne Alexander. Corinne was her former art professor, a woman whose sharp eyes and blunt honesty had guided Aaliyah through the grueling years of her degree. She was the only person who knew exactly how thin the ice was beneath Aaliyah's feet. "Aaliyah, tell me you're sitting down." Corinne's voice crackled through the speaker. "I'm always sitting, Corinne. It's the only way to keep my head from spinning." Aaliyah tried to keep her voice light, but the weariness was a thick layer she couldn't peel back. "I have a lead. It's big, but it's complicated. A nightclub renovation in the city. The owner is a man named Baek Sung-hyun. He's looking for a specific aesthetic, modern, elegant, with subtle Asian influences. He wants an instinctive touch, someone who doesn't just draw, but interprets. I told him your style was the only one that mattered." Aaliyah's hand froze over her trackpad. She knew the name. Everyone in certain circles of the city knew the name Beck. It was whispered in the back of laundry mats and spoken with hushed reverence in corporate boardrooms. It was a name that carried the weight of a shadow empire. "A nightclub?" Aaliyah asked, her eyes drifting to the eviction warning tucked under a magnet on the fridge. "Corinne, I have Micah. I can't exactly spend my nights in a lounge surrounded by whatever it is people like that do. It's just preliminary concept art, Aaliyah. You'd be working directly with his office. He pays in 4 figures for the first draft. Think about the shoes, Aaliyah. Think about the rent." Aaliyah looked at Micah. He had stopped humming and was now carefully stacking his cereal bowls. He caught her gaze and gave her a small, hopeful grin, unaware that his mother was weighing his safety against his survival. Her maternal instinct screamed that a man like Baek Sung-hyun was a wolf, but her reality screamed louder that the cold was a faster killer. "I'll take it," Aaliyah said, her voice dropping into that professional, cautious register that would define her first meeting with him. "Send me the address." As she hung up, she felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the drafty kitchen. She pulled her portfolio toward her, her fingers tracing the edges of the leather. She spent the rest of the night sketching, her pen moving with a desperate, untamed energy. She didn't draw what she thought a mafia boss would want. She drew what she saw in the shadows of the city, strength, solitude, and a strange, jagged beauty. She didn't know then that the man behind the desk at Eclipse wasn't looking for art to decorate his walls. He was looking for a version of the world that didn't lie to him. And Aaliyah, with her guarded eyes and her refusal to smile, was the only one who didn't know how to play the game. She closed her laptop as the sun began to peek through the blinds, clutching Micah's hand as if she could pull him back from the edge of the world she was about to enter. The bank account was still empty, but her heart was full of a terrifying, necessary courage. She would go. She would get the check. and she would never look back. The office was a vacuum of silence, insulated by thick walls and the hum of a high-end ventilation system that carried the faint, expensive scent of sandalwood. Baek Sung-hyun didn't move as Aaliyah approached the mahogany desk. He watched her with the stillness of a predator that had found something it couldn't quite categorize. Beside her, Micah was a small, vibrant splash of color in a room defined by shades of charcoal and steel. The boy's wide eyes darted to the dark suit of the man behind the desk, and then to the vertical tattoo on Sung-hyun's neck, but Aaliyah's hand tightened on his, a silent anchor in an uncertain sea. "Sit," Sung-hyun said, gesturing to the heavy leather chairs. Aaliyah didn't sit. She placed the portfolio on the desk with a clinical precision, her movements deliberate. "I prefer to stand, Mr. Beck. I know your time is valuable, and I'd like to get straight to the concepts." Sung-hyun leaned back, his dark eyes tracing the line of her jaw. Most women in his presence leaned in. They sought the heat of his influence or the shine of his wealth. Aaliyah stood like a soldier behind a shield, her bronze skin luminous yet her expression as unyielding as granite. She wasn't here to be seen. She was here to work. "The portfolio," he prompted, his voice like Logret sandpaper. Aaliyah unzipped the leather case, revealing the sketches she had labored over in the quiet hours of the night. She didn't offer a preamble. She didn't try to sell him on a vision with flowery words. As she laid the first sheet down, Sung-hyun felt a jolt of recognition that had nothing to do with business. The sketches were raw. They were modern, yes, but they possessed a jagged, untamed energy that spoke of the city's hidden pulse. She had captured the way light fractured through broken glass, the way shadows clung to the corners of old brick, the very things Sung-hyun saw every day but never expected anyone else to understand. It wasn't just art. It was an interpretation of the gray world he inhabited. "You didn't follow the brief," he noted, his finger tracing the edge of a drawing that depicted a dragon woven into the neon architecture of a city skyline. The lines were instinctive, almost frantic, yet perfectly balanced. "My manager asked for subtle Asian influences. This is something else. This is the truth of the space," Aaliyah countered, her voice steady despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. She met his gaze directly, a rarity that made him narrow his eyes. "You don't need subtle, Mr. Beck. You need something that feels as heavy as the air in this room. If you want a corporate lounge, you hired the wrong person. If you want eclipse to mean something, this is the direction." Sung-hyun felt a slow, dangerous curl of interest. He had built his life on reading the lies of others, but Aaliyah's work was the most honest thing he had seen in 20 years. He looked at Micah, who had moved to the edge of the desk, looking at the sketches with quiet pride. "And what does the small critic think?" Sung-hyun asked, his gaze shifting to the boy. Micah looked at his mother for permission, then back at the boss. "It looks like the space dragon. He's the one who watches the stars so the monsters don't come out." The air in the room seemed to shift. For a second, the Mafia boss wasn't looking at a contract. He was looking at a mother and son who existed on a plane of reality he had long ago abandoned. Aaliyah shifted, stepping slightly in front of Micah, her wariness returning like a cold front. "If the work is satisfactory, I'd like to discuss the payment schedule," she said, her tone professional and sharp, cutting through the brief moment of humanity. Sung-hyun looked at her, the practical ponytail, the guarded eyes, the lack of a smile that would have made a weaker man crumble. He realized then that he didn't just want her art. He wanted to understand why she looked at him and saw a monster Micah's dragon needed to watch, yet still had the courage to ask for her worth. "It's more than satisfactory," Sung-hyun said, closing the portfolio. "My manager will handle the initial deposit. But I want the rest of the concepts developed here, in the office. I find that consultations work better in person." Aaliyah's eyes narrowed. "I have a child, Mr. Beck. I don't work late-night office hours." "He is welcome here," Sung-hyun replied, the command back in his voice. "He can have the kitchen table. You will have the desk. We start tomorrow." Aaliyah hesitated, the memory of the red numbers on her banking app clashing with the alarm bells in her head. She looked at Micah, then at the man who held her survival in his hands. She nodded once, a brief, sharp movement. "Tomorrow, then." As she gathered her things and led Micah out, Sung-hyun didn't look away. He had the portfolio, But as the door clicked shut, he realized the assessment had only just begun, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't the one in control of the results. The following afternoon, Aaliyah returned to Eclipse, her hand once again a steady anchor for Micah. The club was a different beast during the daylight hours, stripped of its neon pulse and thumping bass. It felt like a sleeping leviathan. The scent of expensive floor wax and stale gin hung in the air as they were led not to the main lounge, but through a series of inconspicuous doors toward the executive wing. Waiting for them in the hallway were two figures who seemed to emerge directly from the shadows. To any casual observer, they were simply well-dressed security, but Aaliyah's sharp artist's eye caught the way they stood, weight distributed for a sudden spring, eyes never settling on a single point for more than a second. "This is Hyenak and Yu Yang," Sung-hyun said, appearing from his office. He had traded his suit jacket for a charcoal vest, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled up to reveal forearms that looked like they were forged from iron. "My shadow team. From today, they are as much a part of your workspace as your pens." Aaliyah felt Micah press closer to her leg. The taller one, Hyenak, gave a brief, stiff nod. He was a man of few words, his face a mask of scarred discipline. Yu Yang, younger and more lithe, offered a small, knowing smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. They weren't just security. They were the human embodiment of the gray area Sung-hyun inhabited, the boundary between the legal world of hospitality and the silent, violent world of the syndicate. "The rules are simple," Sung-hyun continued, his voice dropping into that low, sandpaper rasp. He led them into a secondary office that had been cleared for Aaliyah. A heavy oak table had been set up, and to Micah's delight, a smaller desk sat in the corner, stocked with fresh paper and a box of high-end colored pencils. "While you are here, you are a civilian. In my world, that is a sacred status. It means you do not see what isn't meant for you. You do not ask about the visitors in the lounge, and you do not leave this wing without one of them." He gestured toward Hyenak and Yu Yang, who took up positions at the end of the corridor like twin gargoyles. "You make it sound like a prison," Aaliyah said, her voice professional but laced with that familiar, guarded weariness. She began unpacking her charcoal sticks, her fingers slightly trembling. "It's a sanctuary," Sung-hyun corrected. He walked over to Micah, who was already testing a dragon green pencil. "The rules aren't to keep you in, Aaliyah. They are to keep the rest of the world out. There is a shift in the city. Rivalry isn't a business negotiation, it's a contagion. As long as you are under this roof, you are off limits." Aaliyah looked at the two men in the hall, and then back at Sung-hyun. She realized then that the instinctive danger she had felt the day before wasn't a figment of her imagination. It was a tangible, breathing reality. Sung-hyun wasn't just hiring an illustrator. He was placing her in the eye of a storm and building a fortress around her. As she began to sketch, the rhythmic scratching of her charcoal and Micah's humming became the only sounds in the room. Sung-hyun didn't leave immediately. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her. He watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration and the way she tucked a stray curl behind her ear. He was a man who had spent 20 years reading lies, but as he observed the intense, honest focus of the woman at the table, he felt the heavy walls of his own discipline begin to crack. Hyenak caught Sung-hyun's eye from the hallway, a silent, questioning look. The boss ignored it. He was breaking his own rules. He had always kept civilians at an arm's length, a transactional necessity to be discarded when the job was done. But as Aaliyah looked up, her warm brown eyes meeting his with a silent, defiant challenge, he knew this wouldn't be a clean break. He was a man who lived in the gray, but for the first time, he found himself wanting to see the world in the vibrant, honest colors she spilled onto the page. He stayed until the sun set, a silent sentinel in his own empire, waiting for a smile that still hadn't come. The following morning, the executive wing was quieter. The air settled into a routine that felt both alien and strangely domestic. Aaliyah was lost in the sweeping arcs of a new charcoal study, her fingers blackened with dust, while Micah sat at his smaller desk, his tongue poked out in a gesture of pure, unadulterated focus. Sung-hyun had been on a call for the last hour, his voice a low, rhythmic vibration coming through the open door of his inner office, speaking in rapid Korean that sounded like the crackle of a distant fire. When the call ended, Sung Hyun didn't return to his chair. He walked into the room where Aaliyah worked, his movements fluid and silent. He stood over Micah, watching the boy work. On the paper, a massive, serpentine creature was taking shape, its scales a vibrant mix of emerald greens and deep, midnight blues. It wasn't just a dragon. It was adorned with tiny, shimmering stars along its spine, and its wings were shaped like the rings of a distant planet. The space dragon, Sung Hyun said softly, using the name Micah had mentioned during their first meeting. Micah looked up, not with the fear a man of Sung Hyun's stature usually inspired, but with the bright curiosity of a child who recognized a fellow observer. He has to have the rings, Micah explained, pointing to the wings. That's where he gets his power to fly through the cold parts of the sky. Sung Hyun knelt down, his expensive trousers pulling taut as he brought himself to the boy's level. To Aaliyah, watching from the corner of her eye, the sight was jarring. This shadow king of Seoul's underworld, a man whose neck bore the marks of a lifetime of violence, crouching on a plush rug to discuss the physics of a fantasy creature. And what does he do when he isn't flying? Sung Hyun asked, his voice losing that rough, sandpaper edge, smoothing into something almost gentle. He watches, Micah said, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper. He stays in the shadows so he can see the things that try to be scary. My mom says if you look at the monsters long enough, they get small. The space dragon makes sure they stay small. Sung Hyun's gaze flickered to Aaliyah. She was frozen, her charcoal stick poised over the paper, her eyes wide and guarded. He realized then that this space dragon wasn't just a drawing. It was a metaphor Aaliyah had built to help her son navigate a world that had been unkind to them. It was a shield made of ink and imagination. I could use a space dragon here, Sung Hyun said, his dark eyes returning to the paper. This building is very big, and sometimes the shadows get long. Micah beamed, a gap-toothed smile that seemed to illuminate the dim corners of the office. He picked up a metallic silver pencil and handed it to Sung Hyun. You can help. He needs more stars on his tail. The stars are his eyes. Aaliyah expected Sung Hyun to decline, to stand up and resume his role as the distant, formidable employer. Instead, he took the pencil. His large, scarred hand looked gargantuan next to Micah's small one, but he moved with surprising delicacy. He added several small, sharp points of silver to the dragon's tail, his focus as intense as if he were signing a multi-million-dollar merger. There, Sung Hyun murmured, handing the pencil back. Now he can see everything behind him, too. Thanks, Mr. Beck, Micah chirped, returning to his work with renewed vigor. Sung Hyun stood up, but he didn't leave. He stepped toward Aaliyah's table. The tension between them had shifted. It was no longer just the friction of a boss and an employee, or a predator and his prey. It was something more complex, a bridge built of silver lead and a child's trust. He's a remarkable boy, Aaliyah, Sung Hyun said, his voice back to that low, intimate rasp. He sees the world for what it is, shadows and all, and he isn't afraid. I spent 6 years trying to make sure he wouldn't have to be, Aaliyah replied, finally letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked at the drawing, then at the man standing before her. For a split second, the weariness in her eyes flickered, replaced by a curiosity that mirrored her son's. You're not what I expected, Mr. Beck. The world rarely is, he countered. He lingered for a moment longer, his gaze dropping to her lips, before he turned and walked back into his office. Aaliyah watched him go, her heart thumping a slow, steady rhythm against her ribs. She looked down at her charcoal study, but all she could see were the silver stars on the space dragon's tail, a sign that even in a place built on shadows, someone was watching out for the light. The clock on the wall of the executive wing chimed midnight, a low, melodic sound that seemed to pull the oxygen out of the room. Micah had long since fallen asleep in the small alcove Sung Hyun had prepared, his head resting on a plush pillow, the space dragon drawing clutched loosely in his hand. The club below was in full swing, but up here, the only sound was the scratch of Aaliyah's charcoal and the distant, muffled thumping of a bass line that felt like a collective heartbeat. Sung Hyun emerged from his office, his tie long gone, and the top 3 buttons of his shirt undone. He wasn't carrying a contract or a phone. Instead, He held 2 white cardboard containers and a pair of steaming cups of tea. The scent of ginger, garlic, and toasted sesame oil cut through the clinical smell of the office. "You haven't eaten in 6 hours," he said, setting the food down on the edge of her drafting table. "It's a bad habit for someone who thinks as much as you do." Aaliyah paused, her hand suspended over a particularly intricate shading of a neon archway. She looked at the food, then at him. The guarded weariness was still there, but it was softened by the late hour and the shared silence of the building. She set her charcoal down and wiped her hands on a rag, the black dust smudging her palms. "I didn't realize I was being timed, Mr. Beck," she murmured, accepting the tea. The warmth of the cup seeped into her stiff fingers, grounding her. "I'm an observant man. It's my trade," he replied, leaning against the table beside her. He opened the containers, revealing japchae and spicy bulgogi. "Eat. It's from a kitchen that doesn't exist on any map. My mother's recipe, though she'd never admit I managed to get it right." They ate in silence for a few moments, the tension between them shifting from professional to something uncomfortably intimate. The gray area felt smaller tonight, the boundaries between the Mafia boss and the illustrator blurring in the steam of the tea. "You mentioned your mother," Aaliyah said, her voice quiet to avoid waking Micah. "Is she why you do all this? The nightclubs, the empire, the rules." Sung-hyun looked into his tea, the dark liquid reflecting the sharp office lights. "My mother was a woman who believed in beauty, much like you. My father, however, believed in territory. I inherited the territory when I was 26. I've spent the last decade trying to build enough walls to keep her world safe from his." He looked at her directly, his gaze heavy. "The complications you see, Hyunok, the security, the locked doors, they aren't just for show. They are the price of a life I didn't ask for, but one I refused to lose." Aaliyah leaned back, her bronze skin glowing under the warm lamp. "I know about prices, Sung-hyun. I spent 4 years in art school and 2 years after that wondering if my son would have to choose between a warm coat and a full stomach. My father left when I was Micah's age. He didn't build walls, he just walked through them. And that's why you don't smile," Sung-hyun noted, his voice dropping into that low, sandpaper rasp. "Because you're waiting for the next wall to disappear. I don't smile because I don't owe anyone my joy just to make them feel comfortable," she countered, her eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce honesty. "I am here to work. I am here to provide for my son. I don't need a savior in a dark suit." Sung-hyun felt a jolt of something he hadn't experienced in years, respect. It was a sharp, clean emotion that cut through the cloying flattery he was used to. He reached out, his hand stopping just inches from hers on the table. He didn't touch her, but the air between them vibrated with the possibility of it. "I don't want to be your savior, Aaliyah. I want to be the man who earns the right to stand beside the woman who drew that dragon." He gestured toward the alcove where Micah slept. "The business is complicated, and it is dangerous. There is a man named Wei Chun who thinks he can take what I've built. He sees people as currency. I see you and Micah as something else entirely." "As what?" she whispered. "As a reminder that the world isn't just gray," he said. He stood up, the moment of vulnerability closing like a vault. "Finish your tea. Hyunok will drive you home tonight. And Aaliyah, don't worry about the rent. It's already been handled for the next year. Consider it a bonus for this space dragon's tail." Aaliyah watched him walk back into his office, the door clicking shut with a finality that left her heart racing. She looked at the sleeping boy, then at the black charcoal on her hands. She had come for a check, but as she tasted the salt and spice of his mother's recipe, she realized she was beginning to crave the man behind the shadow. For the first time, the bad habit of thinking too much wasn't about the red numbers in her bank account. It was about the man who was learning to watch the stars just because her son asked him to. The shift in the atmosphere was subtle at first, a tightening of the air that had nothing to do with the climate-controlled precision of the executive wing. It started with the phone calls, sharp, clipped bursts of Korean that Sung-hyun took on the balcony, his back a rigid line against the city's glowing skyline. The gray area was no longer a static boundary. It was shrinking, pressed inward by the encroaching shadows of Wei Chen's ambition. Sung-hyun entered the studio space where Aaliyah was working on the final textures for the eclipse mural. He didn't interrupt her, but the sheer weight of his presence made her charcoal stall against the paper. Behind him, Hyanak and Yu Yang stood closer to the door than usual, their casual stances replaced by a coiled, lethal readiness. "The rules are changing, Aaliyah," Sung Hyun said, his voice dropping into that low, sandpaper rasp. Aaliyah turned, wiping a smudge of black dust from her forehead. "I've noticed the extra ghosts in the hallway, Sung Hyun." Micah asked why the suit uncles are following us to the bathroom now. Sung Hyun didn't offer a reassuring smile. He couldn't. Wei Chun has stopped sentry watching and started moving. A shipment was intercepted at the docks this morning, and a message was left. He's looking for a vulnerability, a crack in the armor I've built around this city. He stepped closer, his dark eyes searching hers with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. To a man like Chun, anything I value is a target. And I have made the mistake of making it very obvious how much I value what is in this room. Aaliyah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the office vents. "You're saying we aren't safe." "I am saying that from this moment. You do not move without a 3-car detail. When you go home, Hyanak will be in the apartment across the hall. Yu Yang will be downstairs. Every delivery, every car, every person who breathes in your direction will be vetted by me." "Sung Hyun, that's not protection," Aaliyah countered, her voice rising with a flash of the guarded weariness that had first captured him. "That's an occupation. I can't live like that. Micah can't live like that. He's 6. He needs to go to the park, not live in a tactical bubble. The park is a killing floor for a child if I am not careful," Sung Hyun snapped, the Shadow King surfacing through the cracks of his composure. He instantly regretted the sharpness, his hand reaching out to steady himself against her table. "I have spent 20 years ensuring that the violence of my world stays on the other side of the glass. But Chun is a man who breaks the glass. If I lose focus, if I let my guard down for a second, I lose the only version of myself that I actually like." He looked toward the alcove where Micah was currently distracted by a robotic engineering kit Sung Hyun had bought him. The protective obsession wasn't just about territory anymore. It was about preserving the only piece of innocence left in his orbit. He was a man who had built an empire on reading agendas, and his current agenda was singular: survival. "I'm not asking for your permission this time, Aaliyah," he said, his tone softening into a plea that felt heavier than a command. "I am asking for your trust. I need to know that when the world outside gets loud, you will stay in the light I've provided." Aaliyah looked at the two men in the hallway, then back at the vertical tattoo on Sung Hyun's neck, the mark of a life that demanded blood for peace. She realized that his obsession wasn't born of a desire to control her, but of a terrifying fear of failing her. The man who had everything was suddenly terrified of losing a woman who had come to him with nothing but a portfolio. "1 week," Aaliyah whispered, her fingers finding his on the table. "1 week of this tactical bubble. After that, we find a way to live, Sung Hyun. Not just survive. Because if we're always hiding, the monsters have already won." Sung Hyun gripped her hand, his thumb tracing the soft bronze of her skin. He didn't tell her that in his world, a week could last a lifetime. He just nodded, the weight of the crown he wore feeling heavier than ever. As he walked back to his office to coordinate the defense of his kingdom, he realized that he wasn't just protecting a civilian anymore. He was protecting his heart, and for a man like him, that was the most dangerous gamble of all. The following Tuesday, the weight of the tactical bubble had begun to wear thin, yet Micah remained the only one seemingly unaffected by the black SUVs and the silent man in the hallway. He sat at his small desk, ignored the red encrypted phone buzzing on Sung Hyun's mahogany table, and worked with a secret, frantic energy. Aaliyah was focused on the far wall, sketching the final dimensions of the Eclipse mural, her back to the room, when Micah hopped off his stool and marched toward the inner office. Sung Hyun was mid-conversation with a contact in Busan, his voice a low, dangerous rumble as he discussed the logistics of Chin's latest provocation. He looked up, his expression sharpening into the mask of the Shadow King. But the mask crumbled the moment he saw the boy. "Mr. Beck." Micah stood at the edge of the desk, holding a piece of construction paper folded into an uneven square. It was decorated with glitter glue that was still slightly tacky and a drawing of the space dragon wearing what appeared to be a party hat. Sung Hyun signaled his contact to hold, and set the phone down. Micah, you're supposed to be finishing your sketches. I finished, Micah said, sliding the paper across the desk. It's for Saturday. It's my 7th birthday. We're having pizza and a space movie. My mom says you're busy being the boss, but I think the space dragon needs to be there. And you too. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the hum of the city and the impossible distance between Micah's world and the one Sung-hyun had built. Aaliyah had stopped sketching. She stood by the mural, her charcoal-stained fingers curling into her palms, her eyes wide as she watched the exchange. She hadn't expected the invitation, and she certainly didn't expect the look of genuine, agonizing conflict that crossed Sung-hyun's face. Saturday, Sung-hyun repeated, his voice barely a rasp. Saturday was the night of the Kim Sato Summit, a mandatory gathering of the city's major players to address the Wei Chun contagion. If Sung-hyun didn't show, it would be seen as a sign of weakness, a crack in the foundation that Chun would exploit within the hour. In his world, a missed summit was a declaration of surrender. I'll have to check my schedule, Micah, he said, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. Micah's face didn't fall. He simply nodded with a solemn understanding that was far too old for a 7-year-old. Okay, but the dragon says stars are easier to see when you aren't alone. As Micah retreated back to his desk, Sung-hyun felt Aaliyah's gaze burning into him. He stood up and walked to where she stood by the mural. The air between them was electric, charged with the impossible choice he now faced. You can't come, she whispered, her voice a mix of relief and a strange, new disappointment. I know what Saturday is. I hear the phone calls, Sung-hyun. I see Hyanak checking his holster every 20 minutes. Don't promise him something that will get you killed. I haven't promised anything yet, he countered, stepping into her space. The scent of her charcoal and the faint vanilla of her perfume was a dizzying contrast to the cold scent of his office. But I have spent 20 years showing up for men I despise. For the first time, I want to show up for someone who actually matters. The syndicate won't let you just walk away for a birthday party, she warned, her hand reaching out to touch the white linen of his sleeve. The price is too high. The price of staying is becoming my father, Sung-hyun said, his dark eyes searching hers. He looked at the vertical tattoo on his neck, the brand of his loyalty to a violent tradition. Then he looked at Micah, who was humming again, oblivious to the fact that he had just handed a Mafia boss a detonator. Sung-hyun picked up the glitter-covered invitation. He knew the tactical logic. Stay, secure the borders, and keep the boys safe by staying away from him. But as he looked at the space dragon in the party hat, he realized that if he chose the syndicate over the boy's smile, he had already lost the war for his own soul. I'll be there, he murmured, more to himself than to her. Aaliyah's eyes searched his, looking for the lie, but she found only a terrifying, reckless sincerity. He'll be waiting by the door, Sung-hyun. Don't break his heart. It's the only thing in this room you can't fix with a check. I know, he said, his hand lingering near hers. I'm counting on it. The doorbell rang at exactly 6 p.m. Aaliyah found herself holding her breath as she pulled open the door of her modest apartment, half expecting a squad of black-clad security to be standing on her welcome mat. Instead, she found Sung-hyun alone. He had traded the razor-sharp lines of his three-piece suit for a soft, charcoal-gray cashmere sweater and dark jeans. He looked younger, less like a king and more like a man, though the vertical tattoo on his neck remained a stark reminder of the world he had left behind at the curb. You came, Aaliyah whispered, stepping aside to let him in. I have a standing appointment with a space dragon, he replied, his voice a low, sandpaper rasp. He held out a small, expertly wrapped box. For the pilot. The apartment was filled with the chaotic, warm energy of a 7th birthday. Micah's two friends were currently engaged in a high-stakes battle with plastic starfighters in the center of the living room, while Aaliyah's friend Malik, a musician from her art school days, sat on the sofa. Malik's protective gaze sharpened the moment Sung-hyun entered, but the tension evaporated as Micah let out a jubilant shout. Mr. Beck, you made it. Micah lunged forward, and for a second, Aaliyah feared the collision. But Sung-hyun caught the boy with a natural ease, hoisting him up with a strength that made Micah's eyes go wide. The evening was a blur of domesticity that felt like a fever dream. The man who dictated the movements of Seattle's underworld sat on the floor, patiently explaining the tactical advantages of different LEGO Starship designs. He didn't check his phone once, despite the persistent vibration Aaliyah knew was the syndicate calling for their missing leader. He ate the cheap pepperoni pizza with genuine relish and laughed, a real, uncalculated sound, when Micah accidentally sprayed him with a burst of soda. As the party wound down and the other children were picked up, the energy in the room shifted into a quiet, cozy lull. Malik lingered for a moment, shaking Sunghyun's hand with a newfound, begrudging respect, before leaving Aaliyah alone with the man who had become her unexpected anchor. Aaliyah moved to the kitchen to tackle the mountain of sticky plates and soda-stained glasses. She had barely started when a large, scarred hand reached into the soapy water beside hers. "I can handle this, Sunghyun," she said, looking up at him. "You've done enough just by showing up." "I like the work," he countered, taking a plate from her and rinsing it with methodical precision. "It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. My world rarely offers such clarity." They washed the dishes in a comfortable silence, the clink of ceramic and the splash of water the only sounds in the small space. It was a scene so profoundly ordinary that it hurt. Seeing him there, his sleeves pushed up to reveal the power in his forearms as he scrubbed a pizza tray, Aaliyah felt the last of her guarded weariness begin to crumble. He wasn't just a boss or a protector. He was a man proving his capacity for a goodness he had long since been told he didn't possess. By the time the kitchen was clean, Micah had drifted off on the sofa, his head lolling against a space dragon pillow, his 7th birthday officially conquered. Sunghyun didn't wait to be asked. He approached the sofa and gathered the sleeping boy into his arms, moving with a tenderness that made Aaliyah's heart ache. He carried Micah down the short hallway to his bedroom, tucked him under the covers, and lingered for a moment in the doorway, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of the boy's chest. When he returned to the living room, the Shadow King was gone, replaced by someone seeking a different kind of kingdom. "He's a remarkable boy, Aaliyah," Sunghyun said softly, standing near her. "He needs stability. He needs consistency. He needs a man who isn't a target," Aaliyah added, though her voice lacked its usual bite. "I know what I am," he finished gently, stepping into her space. "I've never pretended otherwise. But I look at the two of you and I see a possibility, a version of myself that isn't defined by the ink on my skin or the blood in my past." Aaliyah looked at him, seeing the smudge of flour on his sweater and the honest exhaustion in his eyes. She realized then that the biggest moment of tension wasn't at the shipyard or the office. It was right here, in the quiet of her home, where the monsters had finally been made small. The apartment fell into a profound stillness after Micah was tucked away, the kind of silence that only exists in the wake of a storm or the birth of a confession. The faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of a wall clock were the only tethers to the mundane world. Sunghyun stood by the window, looking out at the city lights that usually looked like a chessboard to him. But tonight, they just looked like distance. Aaliyah leaned against the kitchen doorframe, her arms folded over her chest. The domesticity of the last few hours still hung in the air, the scent of pizza and the lingering warmth of a shared task. She watched the man who had effectively shut down the most powerful men in the city just to watch a movie about space dragons. "The summit ended an hour ago," she said softly. "Hyunok sent a message to your phone while you were carrying Micah. He said the Kim family is asking questions. Wei Chun is already looking for the vacancy you left." Sunghyun didn't turn around immediately. "Let them ask. Let them look. For 20 years, I've been a man of perfect attendance and zero distractions. If they think one night of absence makes me weak, they've learned nothing about how I protect what belongs to me." "And what exactly is it that belongs to you, Sunghyun?" Aaliyah's voice was steady, but there was a tremor of vulnerability beneath the professional veneer. "Because I'm not a contract you can sign, and Micah isn't a territory you can hold." He turned then, his eyes dark and heavy with a sincerity that made her breath hitch. He walked toward her, stopping just at the edge of her personal space, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his cashmere sweater. "Nothing in this room belongs to me," he admitted, his voice dropping into that intimate, sandpaper rasp. "And that is exactly why I am here. Everything else in my life is a transaction. I give protection, they give loyalty. I give money, they give service. But you, You give me the truth. You give me a version of myself that isn't a monster." He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before he finally let his fingers graze the soft curve of her jaw. "When you walked into my office, you didn't smile. You didn't play the game. You looked at me with a weariness that matched my own, and it was the first honest thing I'd seen in a decade." Aaliyah didn't pull away. She leaned into the touch, her heart thumping against her ribs like a